They buried Amos Kettering on a Tuesday, and by Thursday there was a woman standing in his kitchen who nobody had ordered, except, it turned out, the dead man had. I've kept this ranch's books for 31 years. I know what every fence post cost, and how many head we lost the winter the snow came sideways. But there's no ledger line for what walked up that road in a gray traveling dress with a carpetbag, and a letter she couldn't have known was already worthless. The ranch everybody understood. Land, cattle, a house with a stove that smoked. That's the part that made sense. That's the part the lawyers had words for. But the ranch wasn't the only thing Amos left behind. He left a promise to people the law said didn't count. He left a debt of water and blood. And he left it all to a man who'd once carried a carbine against the very people that promise was meant to protect. So before you settle in, I'll tell you plain, this isn't a story about a man inheriting a ranch. It's a story about a man inheriting a choice, and about the woman who showed up uninvited and decided, God knows why, to stay and help him make it. I'm going to tell it slow, the way it happened. Some of it still doesn't sit right in me. Stay with me anyway. The grave was still soft when the stage set her down at the fork. I remember that most of all, how the dirt over Amos hadn't crusted yet, still dark and shovel-marked up on the rise under the cottonwood, and how she came walking up the wagon road below it, not knowing she was walking past a fresh dead man she traveled 2,000 miles to marry. I was on the porch step working a piece of mesquite with my knife. That's a thing I do, always have. My hands get to shaking if there's nothing in them, and a man my age with shaking hands looks like a drunk or a coward, and I'm neither, so I whittle. Been carving the same batch of little animals for years, horses mostly, a few birds, one dog that looks more like a possum. I give them to nobody. They pile up in a coffee tin. My knee had locked up in the heat, which it does, and I was cussing it quiet when Eli came out and stood in the doorway behind me, blocking what little breeze there was. There's a woman, he said. I see her. Coming up the road. I see her, Eli. My knees shot, not my eyes. He didn't laugh. He hadn't laughed since he'd arrived 9 days back to find out he owned the place. He was a tall man gone a little stooped, the way men do when they've been carrying something invisible for years, and he had a way of holding still that unsettled the horses. Amos's sister's boy. I'd never met him before the funeral. All I knew of him was what Amos let slip over the years, and Amos hadn't let slip much. My nephew's back from the army. My nephew won't answer letters. My nephew was down at Cybq when it went bad. That last one I'd filed away and tried to forget. Cybq was where the scouts turned and the shooting started and men died on both sides and nobody came home clean. If Eli had been there, that told me something about the stillness in him. It told me where it came from. The woman stopped at the gate. She had a carpetbag in one hand and her other hand up shading her eyes, and even from the porch I could see she was reading the place the way you read a room you've walked into by mistake. The sagging barn. The three of us hands who were left, the rise with the cottonwood and the raw dirt under it. I watched her see the grave. I watched her not understand it yet. Go on, I told Eli. You're the man of the house now. Whatever that woman wants, it's yours to deal with. He went down the steps like a man, walking to his own hanging. Her name was Marion Hale, and she'd come from a town in Missouri I'd never heard of, and she had a letter in her carpetbag with Amos Kettering's own hand on the envelope. We got that much out of her standing at the gate. Before she asked the question, I could see building behind her teeth. I'm looking for Mr. Kettering, she said. Amos Kettering, this is his place. Eli's jaw worked. He was no good at this. It was, he said. Was. She said the word back at him flat, testing it. Her eyes went past him up the rise, and I saw the exact second she made the arithmetic, the fresh grave, the was, the three grim men and no old bridegroom. Her hand tightened on the carpetbag handle until the knuckles went pale. She didn't cry. I want to be clear about that, because it's the first thing I ever knew for certain about Marion Hale, and it turned out to be the truest. She didn't cry when crying would have been easy and forgiven. She just stood there in the heat with her whole future dead on a hill in front of her and said, very quiet, "When?" "Tuesday," Eli said. "His heart. The doctor says his heart just stopped in the night." "Tuesday?" She nodded like she was filing it. "I was on the train Tuesday. Somewhere in Kansas, I expect." She looked at the letter in her hand as if it might argue with her. He wrote that he'd meet the stage himself. That he'd know me by the blue ribbon. She touched the ribbon at her collar, faded and travel limp. I wore it 4 days so he'd know me. I set down my mesquite. Something in the way she said it, 4 days so he'd know me, got in under my ribs and stayed there. "Ma'am," I called down because Eli plainly wasn't going to, "come up out of the sun. Whatever's happened, it happened, and it'll keep happening whether you're standing in the road or sitting in the shade. Come up." She looked at me. Then she looked at Eli. Then, and this is Marion all over, though I didn't know it yet, she made a decision that wasn't hers to make and made it anyway. She opened the gate herself, walked through, and closed it behind her. "All right," she said. "I'll come up." The letter, when Eli finally read it that evening at the kitchen table with the smoking stove ticking behind him, was worse than we'd guessed, and better. Amos had answered a matrimonial notice. An old widower, 61 and rattling around a house too big for him, had written off to an agency back east and paid his fee, and received in return a correspondence with a widow named Marion Hale, 34, no children, husband dead of the cholera 4 years prior, working as a seamstress and boarding house cook, and slowly starving on both. They'd written back and forth the better part of a year. I know because she left the letters out on the table that night, a bundle tied in string, and I'm ashamed to say I read a few. Amos had a better hand than I'd have credited, and a gentler one. He wrote to her about the light on the mesa in the evening. He wrote that he was too old to be foolish but not too old to be lonely, and that he'd understand if she wanted a younger man, but that he'd be kind, and that a woman who could cook for a boarding house of longshoremen could surely stand the company of one quiet old rancher. She'd said yes. She'd sold what she had and bought a ticket and come. And Tuesday, somewhere in Kansas, his heart had stopped, and now she was sitting in his kitchen eating beans off his plate across from a nephew she'd never heard of, in a country that had nothing for her and no way to send her back. "You've a right to know how it stands," Eli told her. He had the look of a man reading a sentence off a paper. "The ranch is mine. My uncle's will was plain about it. There's nothing in it about you. He must have meant to change it, or he didn't think," he stopped. "He didn't think he'd die." "No," Marion said, "people rarely do. I can give you money for a ticket back." "Back to what?" She said it without heat, just laying the fact down between them like a card. "I sold the stove. I sold my mother's clock. There's a woman sleeping in what used to be my room by now. There's no back, Mr. Kettering. Your uncle's letters were the back I had." She looked at the bundle of string-tied paper, and for just a moment the not crying cost her something visible. Then it passed. "I'll work. I can cook and sew, and I'm not afraid of a garden or a wash-pot. Let me stay through the season and earn a ticket to somewhere. That's all I'm asking. A season and honest work for it." Eli looked at me. I looked back at him and kept my mouth shut, because it wasn't my ranch and hadn't been for 9 days, and because I already knew what I hoped he'd say and knew it wasn't my place to say it for him. "A season," Eli said finally. "We'll see how it sits." It was the second best thing he could have said. The best thing he was still years from being able to say, but it was enough for that night. I've put off telling you about the spring because I've been putting it off in my own head for 2 years, and telling this true means I can't put it off any longer. The Rafter Cave's water came from a spring up in the rocks at the head of the Box Canyon on the north edge of the land. In that country, in that dry, a live spring wasn't a convenience. It was the whole hand of cards. Everything south of us for 11 miles came down to that water, one way or another, and everybody knew it. And the man who'd known it best was Royce Vane, who ran the Circle V and had wanted the rafter K's spring the way a starving dog wants a bone it can smell but can't reach. Amos had never sold. Not for money, not for pressure, not for the quiet threats that came dressed as neighborly advice. And there was a reason for that beyond stubbornness, though Amos had stubbornness to spare. The reason had a name. Her name was Nolan. 6 years back, this is before Eli, before Marion, before any of what I'm telling you. Amos had gone up into the rocks after a strayed heifer in the last light, and his horse had gone down in a wash and rolled on him and left him with a broke leg and a caved chest, alone in the dark, in country where a man could die of the night alone. He'd have died. There's no version where he doesn't die up there. Except a woman found him. She was Aravapa, Apache, Western Apache, come down out of the high country with a small band, her old grandmother, her brother Claw, a handful of others moving quiet through land that had been theirs before it was anybody's and was now, on paper, Amos Kettering's. They weren't supposed to be there. By the law of that year and that agent, they weren't supposed to be anywhere but San Carlos, on the flat bad ground where the government had penned so many, and where the fevers took them in summer like the water took the drowning. They'd left, slipped off. They were doing what people do, which is trying to live, in the only country their bodies knew how to live in. And Nolan, who was a healer among her people, a Diyin, though I didn't have the word then and barely have the shape of it now, Nolan found Amos in the wash and did not leave him there. She set his leg. She stayed 3 days in the rocks with a broke old white rancher who'd have shot her people on sight 10 years earlier, and she bound his chest, and she kept a fire, and she sent Claw down for me on the 4th day. And Claw, 19 then, all wire and wariness, walked into this very yard with his hands open, and said in careful English that the old man was up in the rocks and living. And did we want him? We wanted him. We carried Amos down. And Amos Kettering, who was not a soft man, lay in his bed for 2 months and thought hard about what he owed and to whom, and when he could stand again, he rode up to the spring where the band was watering their few horses, and he told Nolan, through Claw, that the water was theirs to use as long as he drew breath, and that no man would move them off it while he stood on his own land, and that this was not charity and he'd thank her not to take it as such. It was a debt. He paid his debts. He never wrote it down. That was the trouble. There was no ledger line for it, no deed, no clause. Just an old man's word, given to people the law had already decided didn't get to hold anybody to a word. And now the old man was 3 days dead, and his word was buried up on the rise under raw dirt with him, and the only paper in the world was the will that made everything Eli's, and made nothing at all Nolan's. I knew all this that first night, watching Marion eat beans in the dead man's kitchen. Eli didn't know any of it yet. He was about to. Royce Vane came up our road 2 mornings later with 3 riders, and a look of practiced sympathy that fit him about as well as a borrowed coat. I saw him coming and went and got Eli out of the barn, and I'll tell you why I hurried. Because I'd seen Vane come courting before, and I knew that a man like that doesn't wait for the grave to settle. He comes while the widow's still stunned. He comes while the new owner's still finding the outhouse in the dark. He comes early because early is when people sign things. Kettering, Vane said, not getting down. He was a wide, ruddy man who'd built himself up from nothing and never forgave anyone else for having started with anything. Royce Vane, Circle V, south and west of you, wanted to pay respects. Your uncle was he was a fixture. He said fixture the way you'd say obstacle. Hard news, him going so sudden. Thank you, Eli said. A man doesn't like to talk business over a fresh grave, Vane went on, which is a thing men say precisely as they begin to talk business over a fresh grave. But you're new to this country and you'll find it's a hard one, and a young man alone with a rundown spread and no cattle sense. No offense meant. I mean you were a soldier, not a stockman. A young man like that might be glad of a clean offer and a fresh start somewhere greener. Might be, Eli said, careful giving nothing. I'll buy the rafter K. Vane named a number. It was an insult wearing the clothes of a windfall enough that a tired, grieving, out of his depth stranger might grab it, far less than the spring alone was worth. Cash. This week. You could be shut of the whole business and gone before the first cold. I watched Eli. I couldn't read him. That stillness of his, it could have been temptation and it could have been fury, and from the outside they looked the same. And the people at the spring? Eli asked. Vane's face did a thing, a small tightening. What people? The Apache band. My uncle gave them the water. Eli's voice hadn't changed at all, which was somehow worse than if it had. You know they're there. You've known longer than I have. There's no Apache got any right to that water or any other, Vane said, and the sympathy was gone now, slewed off clean. There's a renegade band off the reservation squatting on white man's land, is what there is, and the only reason they haven't been run back to San Carlos in irons is that your uncle got soft in the head and the agent's been paid to look the other way. That ends. It ends whoever owns this place. You want my advice? Boys, sell to me, take your money, and don't be standing anywhere near those people when the army comes to collect them. Because it comes. It always comes. For a long moment nobody said anything. A hawk went over. My knee throbbed. I had my knife out and a half-carved bird in my hand, and I realized I'd stopped carving and was just holding it. I'll think on your offer, Eli said. Vane studied him. Then he nodded slow, like a man who's seen this dance 100 times and knows how it ends. You do that. You think on it real careful, and you think on the fact that a spring's only worth something to a man who can hold it. He reined around. My condolences on your uncle, truly. He was a stubborn old fool, and it killed him one way and it'd have killed him another. They rode off. The dust hung a long time in the still air. Eli stood watching the road after they were gone. Silas, he said, what people at the spring, tell me all of it. So I did. Standing there in the yard, I told him about the wash and the broke leg, and the 3 days in the rocks and Nolan and Claw and the old grandmother, and the word Amos gave that no lawyer had ever heard of. I told him how the water flowed and who it kept alive. I told him what San Carlos was, as much as a man like me can know it, the flat ground and the fevers and the counting and the fences. I told him the truth, which was that his uncle had left him a ranch, and tangled up inside the ranch like a thorn in wool, a promise he had no legal obligation to keep, and every human one. Eli listened to all of it without moving. When I was done, he said, I was at Sibq. I know, Amos told me that much. Then you know what I did up there. He looked at me, and for the first time the stillness cracked and I saw what was underneath it, and it was not peace. You know what men like me did to people like the ones at that spring. I know some men did some things, I said carefully. I don't know what you did. No, he said, you don't. And he walked back to the barn and didn't come out for a long time. Marion found the trail to the spring on her 4th day, which surprised nobody who came to know her, and would have surprised the hell out of Vane. She'd asked me, plain over the wash pot where the water came from, and I'd told her up the box canyon, and I'd meant it as a fact and she'd taken it as a direction. By afternoon she'd walked the 2 miles up into the rocks with a covered basket, and by evening she was sitting at the Apache band's fire like she'd been asked, which she hadn't, sharing bread she'd baked in Amos's smoking stove. I know because I went up after her, cussing my knee the whole way, half afraid of what I'd find and wholly unsure what I meant to do about it. What I found was Marion Hale sitting cross-legged in the dust with the old grandmother, the two of them not sharing a word of language between them, passing a piece of fry bread back and forth, and I swear this is true, laughing. The grandmother had said something. Marion hadn't understood a syllable of it, but she'd caught the shape of it, the way you catch the shape of a joke in a foreign room, and she'd laughed, and the old woman had laughed to be laughed with, and that was the whole conversation, and it was complete. Nolan was watching them. I'd known Nolan 6 years, and I'd never once been able to say what she was thinking, and I couldn't then either. She was younger than her bearing made her seem, and she carried herself the way you'd carry water you couldn't spill. When she saw me, she stood, and Claw came up beside her from wherever young men go when strangers approach, and the easy fireside air went taut. "Silas," Nolan said, "my name careful correct. The old man is dead. Not a question. Word travels, it always travels." "Tuesday," I said, "his heart." "And this one." She looked at Marion, still sitting, still holding the grandmother's hand now, watching us with those steady eyes that missed nothing. "This one is his woman." She was going to be. She came late. I didn't know how to say the rest. "There's a new man owns the ranch now, his nephew, and the new man—" I stopped, because I didn't know the end of that sentence, and it was a coward's thing to start a sentence you can't finish in front of people whose lives hang on the end of it. "The new man will do what new men do," Nolan said. And she looked at me, and she wasn't asking me to promise anything, because she'd lived long enough and lost enough to know what a white man's promise on another white man's behalf was worth, which was nothing, which was less than the fry bread in the old woman's hand. "You should take her back down before dark. It is a bad road at night. I know." Something almost moved at the corner of her mouth. "I found the old man on a bad road at night." Marion got to her feet then, brushing the dust from her gray skirt, and she came over and she did a thing I'll remember when I've forgotten most of my life. She took Nolan's hand, Nolan, who had gone stone, and she held it in both of hers, and she said, "Thank you for the fire, for letting me sit." And then, because she was Marion and couldn't help it, "I don't know what's coming. I don't know what he'll do, the new man. But I know he's got his uncle's letters, and I've read every one, and there was one thing that old man wrote about more than the land, more than being lonely, more than me. He wrote about a debt he was proud to owe. He never said to who, but I think I've just met her." Claude translated it, low and fast, for the grandmother. The old woman stopped laughing. She looked at Marion for a long moment. Then she said something, and Claude didn't translate it, and Nolan's face changed just slightly, just once, and she took her hand back from Marion, gently, not a rejection, just a reclaiming, and she said, "Go down now, both of you. Before the dark." We went down. Marion was quiet the whole way, which for her meant something was working in her. At the bottom, where the canyon opened onto our road, she stopped and looked back up at the rocks where the small firelight showed, and she said, "He's going to have to choose, isn't he? You're Eli, between the ranch and them. Vane won't let him have both." "Looks that way," I said. "And you don't know which he'll choose?" "No," I said. "I don't. He was at Sibq. He carries something. A man like that," I shook my head. "A man like that, you can't tell if the past makes him do the right thing to pay it off or the wrong thing to keep from ever looking at it. I've known it go both ways." Marion nodded slow. She touched the faded blue ribbon at her collar, the one she'd worn 4 days so a dead man would know her. "Then we'd better help him look at it," she said. And that, a widow 4 days in a country that had nothing for her, with no stake in a spring or a band or an old man's buried word, deciding we'd better help him look at it. That's where I knew the season she'd asked for was going to be longer than a season, and that whatever came next, Marion Hale was going to be standing in the middle of it. I just didn't yet know how much it would cost her to stay. None of us did. The water came down brown on a Sunday, and that's how we knew Vane had made his move. I was first to see it. I'd gone down to the stock tank at dawn to break the skim of night cool off the top, the way I do, and instead of the clear cold I expected, there was a slick of gray-brown sliding into the tank from the ditch, thick as weak coffee, carrying a smell that wasn't the honest mud smell of live water. It was the smell of something dead upstream, something put there. I stood looking at it a while. My knee ached the way it does before rain, though there wasn't a cloud from horizon to horizon. Then I went and got Eli. He came out buttoning his shirt, hair still flat from the pillow, and he crouched at the tank and put 2 fingers in the fouled water and smelled them and didn't say anything for a moment. Behind us the door opened, and Marion came out with her sleeves already pushed up. She'd taken to rising before all of us, which nobody had asked her to and nobody was fool enough to complain about, and she came and looked and her face went hard. "That's not runoff," she said. "No," Eli said. "Somebody did that." "Yes." She looked up the canyon, toward the spring 2 miles off in the rocks, and I watched her make the same leap I'd made. "The band," she said. "They drink from the head of it. If somebody's fouling the water partway down, then partway up." "They wouldn't foul their own drinking source," I said. "Whoever did it below the spring and above us. Fouled our share, left theirs. That's a message aimed at this ranch." Eli stood, wiping his fingers on his trousers. That stillness of his had a new quality that morning, not the frozen kind, the kind that comes before a man moves. "Saddle up, Silas," he said. "I want to see the whole run of it, ditch to spring. I want to know exactly what they did and exactly what it means." "Your knee," Marion started, meaning mine, and I gave her a look that told her a man doesn't get his knee mentioned twice in one lifetime by a woman he's known 9 days, and she pressed her lips together, and I'll give her this. She almost smiled. "I'll pack water and bread," she said instead. "You'll be gone all day, and Mr. Kettering," Eli turned, "whatever you find up there, come tell me. Don't decide it all on the ride down and hand me the finished thing. I'm in this house too now." He looked at her a beat, longer than the words needed. "All right," he said. What we found took the whole day and turned my stomach twice over. They'd been thorough, Vane's men. 2 miles up, where a side wash fed the main channel a 1/4 mile below the spring, somebody had driven a butchered steer carcass down into the water and staked it under with fence posts, so the whole slow seep of decay ran down into the rafter K's share and none of it up toward the band. It was clever and it was cruel and it was legal. A man could always claim a steer wandered off and died in a wash, couldn't he? Terrible thing, and who was to prove otherwise? It fouled our stock water and left the Apache drinking clean, which meant that when the trouble came, and Vane meant for trouble to come, a man could stand up and say, "Look, the ranch's water's poisoned and the renegades is fine. Ask yourself why. Ask yourself what those people know about poisoning wells." Eli understood it before I finished explaining it. He was a soldier. He knew how a lie gets built to look like a fact. "He's not just after the spring," Eli said. "We were sitting our horses at the fouled wash, the stink rising in the heat. He's building a story, the kind that brings the army, the kind where nobody looks too hard because the ending's already the one they wanted. That's about the size of it." He was quiet. A raven went over and another. They smelled the steer. "At Sibque," Eli said, and I went still because he hadn't spoken that word since the day in the yard. "It started like this, not with a battle, with a story, that the medicine man was raising the dead and stirring the tribes, and it was going to be a war if somebody didn't stop it. By the time anybody with sense could ask whether the story was even true, we were already up there with carbines. The story got there first. The story always gets there first." He looked at me. "I helped carry the story, Silas. I didn't ask the questions. I was 23 and I wanted to be a good soldier, and a good soldier doesn't ask whether the story's true, he just carries it. And people died. Scouts we'd eaten beside. An officer I liked. Apache who'd done nothing but dance." His jaw worked. "I've spent 5 years telling myself I'd know better next time. And here's next time, standing in a wash, stinking." I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't have been a smaller thing than what he just handed me. "Let's get the carcass out," he said finally, "and ride up and tell them what's coming. They've a right to know a story's being built with them as the villains, even if there's nothing they can do about it, especially then." We hauled the steer out with a rope and both horses, and it was ugly work, and my knee will never forgive me for it. But I noticed something while we worked, and it stayed with me. Eli did the worst of it himself. The rope end in the rot, the wading in. A man trying to sell a ranch and be gone doesn't wade into a fouled wash to the waist to spare his hired hand's bad knee. I filed that away, the way I file things. The band already knew, of course. They always knew first. But Nolan let Eli tell her anyway, which I understood later was a courtesy. She was letting him be the man who came up to warn them, letting him do the thing, because she'd learned that white men who mean well need to be permitted to prove it, and white men who don't mean well won't bother to climb the canyon. It was the first time Eli and Nolan had spoken face to face. I watched them take each other's measure across the fire. Claw stood ready to translate, but Nolan's English was better than she let on. I'd always suspected it, and now I was sure, watching her follow Eli's words a half-beat ahead of the translation. "There is a man named Vane," Eli said. "He's poisoning the ranch's water and leaving yours clean, so that when he brings soldiers, he can point and say the poison came from you." Nolan's face didn't change. "I know this man, not his name, his kind. There is always this man." She looked at Eli a long moment. "You are the new one, the soldier." Eli didn't flinch from it. "Yes. You were where the scouts died. San Carlos knows this. Word came down the canyon before you did." She let that sit, let him feel that he'd been known and weighed before he ever climbed up. "My cousin died there. At the place with the creek. Not fighting, after, when the soldiers were afraid and shot at everything that moved in the dark." She said it flat, the way Marion had said people rarely do, and it landed the harder for it. "So, the man who helped kill my cousin's people comes up my canyon to tell me a white man wishes me ill. This I already know. Why do you come, soldier?" The fire popped. Everyone was very still. Claw had stopped even pretending to translate. I have thought many times about what Eli might have said. He could have defended himself. He could have said, "I didn't shoot your cousin. I wasn't in that part of it. You don't know what I did or didn't do." It might even have been true, but he didn't say any of it. "Because your cousin's people should have known the story coming for them," Eli said. "And nobody climbed up to tell them. I was one of the men who didn't climb up." He held her eyes. "I'm climbing up now. It's 5 years late and it's the wrong canyon and it won't bring back one single soul. I know that. I'm not here to be forgiven. I'm here because there's a story being built with your people as the poisoners, and I'll be damned if I carry another story I didn't ask a question about. That's all. That's the whole of it." Nolan looked at him for a long time. Then she said something to the grandmother, in Apache, low. And the old woman, who had been watching Eli the whole while with those bright buried eyes, said something back short. And Nolan's mouth did that small almost thing at the corner. "My grandmother says," Nolan translated, "that you talk like a man carrying a stone uphill. She says, better than a man who has thrown his stone in the river and calls himself clean." A pause. "She says you may sit. Once." Eli sat. It wasn't forgiveness. Marion was right about that later when I told her. It wasn't forgiveness, Silas. Don't you dare call it that. It was something harder and better. It was being allowed to start owing. But it was the first time I'd seen Eli sit anywhere like a man who belonged in the chair. The weeks that followed were the good weeks, and I've learned to be suspicious of the good weeks. Because, in my experience there, the deposit the world takes before it charges you the bill. Work is what did it, not talk. There was a fence down along the whole east line that Amos had let go in his last year, and there was no money to hire it done, so it got done by the 4 of us. Me, Eli, Marion, and more days than not Claw, who came down the canyon and worked our fence for reasons he never explained and I never asked, though I think part of it was that a young man penned up in the rocks needs work for his hands the way I need wood for mine. Marion worked the fence line like she'd been born to it, which she hadn't, and her hands cracked and bled, and she wrapped them in strips of an old petticoat and kept going. She and Eli fell into the rhythm 2 people fall into when they're carrying opposite ends of the same heavy thing all day. He'd steady a post, she'd tamp it. She'd hold the wire, he'd staple. They didn't talk much, and when they did it wasn't sweet. It was higher and not so tight and your ends dropping. But I watched it happen, the thing that happens. slower than a story would have it and truer. I watched Eli start looking for her in a work party before he knew he was looking. I watched Marion save the last of the water in her canteen for him without making a thing of it, just handing it over, because his throat was rawer from the day's cussing. One evening, this is the part I have to tell, though it's small, a summer storm came up sudden the way they do, and we all ran for the barn, and in the barn in the wet dark, waiting it out, the grandmother, who'd come down that day with Cla, curious about Marion's stove, started to hum something. Just an old woman humming to herself in a storm. And Marion, without a word, took up her wash day tune underneath it, the two melodies not matching, not trying to, just two women humming in a barn in the rain. And the grandmother reached over and took Marion's cracked, bleeding, petticoat-wrapped hand and held it while she hummed. And Eli watched them, and I watched Eli, and I saw on his face the exact look of a man realizing that the ranch he'd nearly sold had something in it he didn't have words for and hadn't earned and wanted now, more than he wanted to be shut of the country. That was the deposit. Here comes the bill. It came on a market day, when Cla went down to the settlement for salt and nails. He didn't come back by dark. By full dark Nolan was in our yard. She'd never come down to the ranch before, not once in 6 years, and the sight of her standing in the firelight of our doorway told me before she opened her mouth that something was badly wrong. "Cla has not come," she said. "He went for salt, he has not come." We rode in, Eli and I, and Marion insisted, and Eli, to his credit, didn't waste breath arguing, just told her to bring the medicine box. We found Cla behind the settlement's one saloon in the alley, and he was alive, which was the only good word I have for the state of him. They'd worked him over. 3 of Vane's men, the barkeep said when Eli got hold of him by the collar. 3 of Vane's riders had seen an Apache buying nails like a free man and decided to educate him on his station. Broke 2 of his fingers, cracked his ribs, left him in the muck to teach the lesson that the settlement wasn't for his kind and never would be, Will or Law or Amos Kettering's dead word be damned. Eli went very quiet at the sight of him, the dangerous kind. The men were still in the saloon. That's the thing about that kind of cruelty. It doesn't even bother to run, because it's never once had to answer for itself. They were at the bar laughing when Eli walked in, and I went in behind him with my heart going sideways, because I knew this could end 4 different ways and 3 of them were graves. I won't tell it all. It went hard for a minute. But here's the part that mattered. Eli didn't shoot anybody, though I think he wanted to, and God knows he'd have been within some rough frontier right too. He walked up to the biggest of the 3, a rider named Collie, and he said loud so the whole saloon heard it, "That man you beat is under my protection. He works my fence and drinks my water, and he's got more standing on the rafter K than any of you 3 ever will. You touch him again, or any of his people, and you'll answer to me, and I was at Sibq, so you can measure for yourselves what I'm willing to do to men who hurt the helpless. I've done it. I know the weight of it. Try me and find out I'll carry that weight again for the right people this time." Now that was a fine speech, and it near stopped my heart with pride. But I want you to understand what it cost, because a story that only shows the fine part is a lie, and I promise to tell this true. It cost him the settlement. From that night on, the whole valley knew that the new man at the Rafter K had taken the Apache side in front of witnesses, had thrown Sibq in decent men's faces like it was a thing to be proud of, had made himself an Indian lover and a renegade's protector. Vane didn't need to build his story anymore. Eli had handed him the villain, gift-wrapped, a disgraced soldier gone soft and strange, siding with off-reservation renegades against his own kind. Half the men who might have stayed neutral now had a reason to want the Rafter K brought low. Eli had won the alley and lost the valley, and he knew it walking out, and he did it anyway. We got Cla home. Marion set his fingers by lamplight in the Apache camp with Nolan guiding her hands, the 2 women working over the boy without a wasted motion, and I stood in the dark outside the ring of firelight and watched a widow from Missouri and a healer from the high country save a young man's hand between them, and I thought, whatever comes now, that happened. That's real. Nobody can unhappen that. I should have known better than to think a thing like that was safe just because it was real. The fever came for Marion 4 days later, and that's when I learned what Nolan had been carrying under all that stone. We didn't know what it was at first. Marion just went hot and wrong out of nowhere, the way the bad fevers do in that country, a cut on her fence-torn hand gone sour likely, though we never knew for certain. By the second night she was raving, talking to her dead husband, talking to Amos she'd never met, talking to the blue ribbon like it could answer. Eli sat with her and didn't sleep, and there was a look on him I hadn't seen and hoped never to see again. The look of a man who's found the one thing he can't afford to lose exactly one moment after he's admitted to himself he has it. The doctor was a 2-day ride and a vain man besides. Wouldn't have come up our road for love or money now. So Eli did the thing I wouldn't have credited him for. He rode up the canyon in the dark on the bad road, the road where Amos had near died, and he stood in the Apache camp and he asked Nolan, the woman whose cousin his kind had killed, the woman he'd been allowed to sit near once, he asked her to come down and heal his white bride. He had no right to ask it. He knew he had no right. He asked anyway because Marion was dying and pride is a thing you can afford right up until you can't. And Nolan came. She came down the bad road at night with her medicine and her grandmother, and she worked over Marion for 3 days, the same 3 days she'd once worked over Amos in the rocks. I don't think that number was lost on any of us, and she pulled Marion back from wherever the fever was taking her. Roots I didn't know the names of. A poultice on the sour hand. Songs, low, in a tongue Marion couldn't understand and answered anyway in her raving, the way she'd answered the grandmother's joke that first day, catching the shape of a thing across the gap of language. On the 3rd night the fever broke. Marion woke up thin and hollow-eyed and found Nolan sitting beside her bed, and she reached out her healing hand, the sour one, drawn clean now, and took Nolan's, and neither of them said anything, because by then they were past the place where saying was needed. But here is what I have to tell you, the thing I overheard and wasn't meant to and have never told a living soul until now. That 3rd night, before the fever broke, when it was still an even bet whether Marion would see morning, I couldn't sleep and I went out for air, and I passed the window, and I heard Eli and Nolan talking low in the dark of the sick room. "Why did you come?" Eli said. "I had no right to ask it after Sibq, after everything. Why did you come down the bad road for her?" And Nolan was quiet a long moment, and then she said, "Because the old man came for no one and I found him anyway and I did not leave him, and he remembered it every day of his life until his heart stopped. That is a thing worth more than water, soldier, to be remembered by someone who owed you nothing." A pause. "Your bride sat at my fire and laughed with my grandmother in a language she does not speak. She set my brother's fingers with her own bleeding hands. She owes me nothing and I owe her nothing, and so," I heard her stand, "so I do not leave her. Do you understand this? I do not leave people on bad roads. It is the one thing your kind never learned and mine will die still knowing." And Eli said very low, "Teach it to me." And Nolan said, "I cannot teach it. You learn it or you do not. We will see which." And she went back to her patient. I stood outside that window in the dark with my bad knee screaming and my throat too tight to swallow, and I did not go back to bed for a long time. Vain came the morning after Marion could sit up. He didn't come alone this time, and he didn't come pretending sympathy. He came with the Indian agent from San Carlos, a soft pale man named Bright with ink on his fingers and nothing behind his eyes, and a paper, and 6 riders, and the particular ease of a man who's finally holding the cards he's been waiting on all along. "Kettering," Vane said, "still didn't get down. You've had a hard month. Your bride's been poorly, I hear. Your reputation's been poorlier. A thin smile. I did warn you, standing near those people. Well. Eli came out onto the porch. Marion came out behind him, pale and thin and upright, one hand on the door frame, and she would not go back in when he glanced at her, and he didn't make her. Say what you came to say, Vane. It's not me saying it. It's Agent Bright. Vane nodded to the soft, pale man, who cleared his throat and read from his paper in a flat administrative drone that made my skin crawl worse than any shouting could have. There was a band of renegade Apache off the San Carlos reservation, the paper said, unlawfully at large, and there had been reports, mind, from concerned citizens of livestock poisoning and threat to the settlement's water. The band was to be returned to San Carlos. The army had been requested and would arrive within the week. Any person found harboring, aiding, or protecting the said renegades on private or public land would be subject to arrest and prosecution, and any property used to harbor same could be seized in connection with the offense. Bright lowered the paper. You understand what that means, Vane said, and now he was enjoying himself, the ruddy face lit up with it. The minute the army comes and finds those people on your spring, this ranch is a harboring property, seizable, and you, Kettering, arrestable, a disgraced soldier protecting renegades. Why, they might hang you and count it a mercy to the territory. He let it sit. Or, Eli said, or you sell to me, today. Same price as before. No, I'm a generous man. I'll knock 1,000 off for the trouble you've caused me, but you'll take it and be grateful. You sell, the band's no longer your problem or your crime, and you and your sickly bride ride out of here alive and free and never think about that spring again. The army takes the renegades. That's happening either way, boy. That was always happening. The only question on this porch is whether you're standing next to them when it does, or 100 miles gone with money in your pocket. He leaned on the saddle horn. One day, Kettering, I'll want an answer by this time tomorrow. Sell and live or stand and hang. I'd think it over real careful, and I'd think about her. He tipped his hat at Marion. You just got her back. Shame to lose her to a rope over a spring, and a pack of renegades that'll be dead of the fever at San Carlos, inside 2 years regardless. He reined around. The agent folded his paper. The 6 riders wheeled after them. And the dust hung in the still air, the way it had the first day, and I stood on the porch with a half-carved bird in my hand that I'd forgotten I was holding. Nobody spoke for a long while. Then Marion, still gripping the door frame, her voice thin from the fever but steady as a fence post, said the thing none of us had the nerve to. He's not wrong, Eli, that's the terrible part. He's not wrong about a single thing except which choice you'll make. She turned her hollow eyes on him. Sell and live, or stand and hang, and no third door, no clever way out, no letter of Amos's that fixes it, just the 2 doors and one day to walk through one. Eli said nothing. He was looking up the canyon, toward the spring, toward the small band of people who'd come down a bad road for a dying woman who owed them nothing. And I looked at his face, and for the life of me, after everything, after Sibque and the alley and the 3 days at Marion's bedside, for the life of me, I could not tell which door he was going to choose. He didn't choose that night, and I want to tell you it was courage that held him. But I think part of it was that a man can't choose between 2 doors while he's still hoping for a third. Eli sat up till the lamp guttered, going through Amos's papers. All of them. The deed, the tax receipts, the ledgers in my own hand, the string-tied bundle of Marion's letters. I sat up with him because my knee wouldn't let me sleep and my conscience wouldn't let me leave him alone with it. Somewhere past midnight, he stopped turning pages and put his face in his hands, and I thought he'd finally struck bottom, and I was about to say something useless when Marion spoke from the doorway. She got up out of her sickbed, thin as a rail, wrapped in a quilt, and neither of us had heard her. You're looking for a paper that says the water's theirs, she said. There isn't one. I've read every letter in that bundle twice over. Amos never wrote it down. She came and lowered herself into the chair across from him, slow, careful of her strength. But he wrote around it. In one of the letters to me, the fourth one, I think, he said he'd done one thing in his life he was proud of, and it wasn't the ranch and it wasn't outlasting Vane. He said he'd given his word to some people the law forgot, and that keeping it was the only thing that made him feel like the country hadn't ruined him. She looked at Eli. That's not a deed. It won't stand in front of Agent Bright's paper, but it's not nothing either. It tells you what the man wanted. And you keep asking what to do like the answer's hidden in these pages when the truth is you've known it since the alley. Eli lifted his head. Knowing it and being able to do it aren't the same thing, Marion. He said it plain. Stand and hang. I'm not just gambling my neck. I'm gambling this ranch and your life in it, and I promised you a season and a way out. You promised me a season, Marion said. I've had my season. I got up off a deathbed a woman from Missouri healed me off of, and I'm sitting in a kitchen a dead man built, married in every way that matters to a man I've held wire for and set fingers beside. And I'll tell you what I'm not going to do, Eli Kettering. Her voice cracked but didn't fall. I'm not going to ride out of here 100 miles with money in my pocket while soldiers march people I've laughed with back to a place their children die in. I sold my mother's clock to come to this country. I'm not selling the only thing I've found in it that was worth the trip. She stood, unsteady, and gripped the table. You do what you can live with, but don't you dare do the cowardly thing and tell yourself it was for me. I won't have it laid at my door. I'd rather be poor and standing than rich and gone. And if that's not the woman you thought you were stuck with, then you didn't read the letters close enough either. And she went back to bed. Eli looked at me across the guttering lamp. I married the wrong one, Silas, he said, and for the first time in all the weeks I'd known him, he almost smiled. Amos ordered a wife and I got the widow, and she's twice the trouble he bargained for, and I wouldn't trade her for the deed to the whole territory. Then you know your door, I said. I know my door. He rubbed his eyes. I just don't know how to walk through it without it killing everyone I'd be walking through it for. Vane's right about the one thing. The army's coming either way. Standing brave in front of them doesn't stop a column of cavalry. It just adds my body to the pile. He looked at the papers. There's got to be a way to break the story, Silas. Not the army. The story underneath it. Because Sibq taught me one thing, if it taught me anything, the guns only come because the story got there first. Kill the story, and maybe the guns don't have anywhere to point. I thought about that. And then I thought about Agent Bright, with his ink-stained soft fingers and his nothing eyes, reading off that paper in a drone, and a thing Nolan had said weeks back came up in me. Eli, I said slow. Nolan told me once the only reason the agent hadn't run the band back to San Carlos years ago was that he'd been paid to look the other way. Paid by Amos, we always figured to leave the band be. But what if that's backwards? What if Bright takes money from everybody? What if the reason he's come out with Vane now, reading that paper, is that Vane finally outbid a dead man? I leaned forward. A paper's only a story too, and a story's only as strong as the man reading it. What happens to that paper if the whole territory learns the agent who signed it takes bribes to point his soldiers wherever the money's thickest? Eli went very still. You'd need proof, he said. Vane's word against a dead man's, that's nothing. I wouldn't need Vane, I said. I'd need somebody who watched the money change hands, somebody who was there both times. Somebody nobody would ever think to ask, because they don't count him as a person who can testify. I met his eyes. Claw went to San Carlos every season for years, Eli. Carried messages between Amos and the band. You think a boy that watchful never once saw an old rancher hand a soft pale agent an envelope in the dark. Eli sat back. Something moved in his face, the first real light I'd seen in it in days. He can't testify, Eli said. No court in the territory takes an Apache's word. No court, I agreed. But a court's not the only place a story lives, is it? There's a newspaper in the county seat. There's the settlement that loves a scandal more than it loves Vane. There's the army itself, which doesn't like being made a fool of by a bribed clerk any more than the next man. I spread my hands. You can't outlaw Vane, Eli, but maybe you can outstory him. Make it so that the minute the army arrives, the interesting question isn't the renegades on the spring. It's why the agent who called them in has been taking Vane's money to do it. Make the story about Bright, and Vane's whole house comes down, because the paper's only worth anything as long as nobody's looking too hard at the man who wrote it. For a long moment Eli didn't move. Then he stood up so fast the chair went over. "I need Claw," he said, "and I need him before dawn, and Sila's." He was already reaching for his hat. "Your knee's going to hate me. Because I need you to ride to the county seat, and I need you to ride now. I'll spare you the ride. My knee has already told that story to itself 100 times, and it doesn't improve in the telling. 2 days each way, and I'm too old for it, and I did it anyway, and I carried in my saddlebag a thing Claw had given me in the gray before dawn. Because Claw had seen it more than once. And when Eli and Nolan sat him down and explained, not asked, explained, because they'd learned by then that Claw was a man and not a tool. When they laid out what his memory might do, that boy with his 2 splinted fingers thought about it a long while, and then he said something to Nolan in Apache, and Nolan translated it, and it was this. He says he watched them make his people into a story for years. He says if his eyes are good enough to be the villain in their story, they are good enough to be the truth in ours. He gave a full accounting, dates near as he could reckon them by the seasons, the place behind the agency stores always at night, the envelopes, once a saddlebag. He'd seen Vane's man collie hand Bright money not 4 months back, in the spring, right about the time the fouling of our water was being planned. It wasn't a court deposition. It was better and worse than that. It was a witness the territory had spent years teaching itself not to hear, saying a thing so specific it could be checked. I carried it to the newspaper man at the county seat, a sour, sharp fellow named Deal who hated Vane for reasons of his own that I never learned and didn't need to. And I told him he could have the biggest story of his career if he moved fast, and I gave him the dates and the places, and I told him where he could quietly check them against the agency's own supply records, which a clerk who owed Deal a favor could reach. Deal checked. The dates lined up with agency shortfalls, supplies signed for and never delivered, the difference gone somewhere. It wasn't proof of a bribe, but it was proof of a thief, and a thief is a story a newspaper can print, and once the territory was asking whether Agent Bright was a thief, it was a short walk to asking whether his renegade poisoning paper was worth the ink it was droned off of. Deal printed it the day before the army column was due. I got back to the rafter the evening the soldiers came. They came up the wagon road below the cottonwood, below Amos's grave, which had crusted over hard by then, gone the gray of the country. A lieutenant and maybe 20 men, dusty and bored and wanting this over. Vane rode with them, and Bright had the look of a man who'd read something about himself in a newspaper that morning and hadn't yet decided how frightened to be. The band was at the spring. They hadn't run. That was their choosing, and I'll come to it because it's the heart of the whole thing and I've been circling it. Eli met the column in the yard. Marion stood on the porch, upright now, her strength mostly back, the blue ribbon at her collar. She'd taken to wearing it again. I never asked why. I stood by the porch post with my knife and a piece of wood, because a man does what his hands know how to do while the world decides itself. "Lieutenant," Eli said, "you've come a long way on a paper signed by a man who's in this morning's newspaper for stealing from the very people he sent you to collect." The lieutenant, young, but not a fool, I could see that right off, looked at Bright. "I've read the paper, Mr. Kettering. It's why I'm asking questions instead of giving orders. But a newspaper's not a court, and I've got a written order from the agency, and a report of poisoned water and threat to a settlement supply. That order stands until somebody with more authority than a county editor tells me otherwise." The poisoned water's the ranch's water, Eli said. Not the settlements. Mine. And it wasn't poisoned by the Apache, it was poisoned below the spring and above my tanks, so the fouling ran to me and left them clean. You want to see it? I'll take you to the wash right now and show you the fence post still driven in where a steer was staked under the water. Ask yourself, Lieutenant, why a band would poison a white man's tank 2 miles downstream of themselves and leave their own drinking water sweet. Then ask who benefits from you thinking they did. He didn't raise his voice. You're a soldier. So was I. I was at Sibq. You know what Sibq was? It was good men killing on a story that turned out to be smoke, because nobody stopped to ask a question before the guns came out. I'm asking you to be a better soldier than I was. Ask the question, before the guns. The lieutenant looked at him a long moment. Sibq meant something to him. I saw it land. Every soldier in the territory knew Sibq, and none of them wanted their name on the next one. Vane, the lieutenant said, not turning. The witness in the paper, the one who claims he saw money change hands. Where's he? An Apache, Vane said, and he put a curl on the word that had worked in this country his whole life. A renegade's kin. You'd take the word of. I didn't ask you whose word it was, the lieutenant said, and there was a cold snap in it that shut Vane's mouth. I asked where he is, because Mr. Bright here has gone the color of a fish, and I've got agency supply records that don't add up, and I've got a bad feeling I've been marched 200 miles to be somebody's cudgel. I don't like being a cudgel, so I'll hear the witness, court or no court. I'll hear him with my own ears and make my own judgment, which is a thing that is still, last I checked, my job. And that is how it came to pass that Claw with his splinted fingers, Claw, who'd been beaten in an alley for buying nails like a free man, came down the canyon and stood in the Rafter K's yard in front of 20 cavalry and told a young lieutenant, through Nolan, exactly what he'd seen behind the agency stores across the years. The dates, the envelopes, Collie's face in the spring, 4 months back. He stood straight and he did not hurry and he did not look at the ground once. Bright broke before Claw finished. Not with a confession. Men like Bright don't confess, they explain, and the explaining is its own kind of confession. He started talking about discretionary allowances and the complexities of agency provisioning and the impossibility of a savage understanding legitimate administrative arrangements, and every word he said dug the hole deeper, because a man who's done nothing wrong doesn't have 6 explanations ready, and the lieutenant knew it, and Vane knew the lieutenant knew it. And I watched Royce Vane's face as the thing he'd built all these years came apart in the yard in front of the very soldiers he'd summoned to finish it. The lieutenant did not arrest anybody that day. It wasn't his to do, that would be for the courts and the Army's own inspectors, and a slow grinding machinery that would take months. But he did the one thing that mattered on that afternoon in that yard. He refused to march the band to San Carlos on a thief's paper. He said he'd report what he'd heard, that the order was suspended pending inquiry into Agent Bright's conduct, and that he'd be recommending the whole matter be looked into by men who answered to Washington and not to Royce Vane. Then he looked at Vane, and he said something I've kept in a good place in my memory all these years since. You brought me here to be your gun, Mr. Vane, he said. I've decided I'd rather be a soldier. There's a difference. Your dead neighbor seems to have known it. And he glanced up the rise, at the gray-crusted grave under the cottonwood, and then he formed his column and rode back down the wagon road the way he'd come, and Vane and Bright rode after him, because there was nothing else on that whole ranch left for them to do. Now here's the cost, because I promised you the truth, and the truth is that it didn't come free, and stories that come free aren't worth the telling. The band left anyway. Not that season, but by the next. I have to tell it careful because it would be easy to tell it wrong, to make it sound like a defeat, or worse, like their choosing didn't matter. It mattered most of all. That's the whole point. What Eli won them was time, and honesty, and a spring nobody could take by a lie. What he could not win them was a country, because the truth Nolan had known all along, the truth she tried to teach Eli and couldn't, the one you learn or you don't, was that even a good white man's protection is a cage with a kind door. The band could stay on the Rafter Cays spring as long as Eli Kettering drew breath and kept his word, just as they'd stayed as long as Amos had. But that was a life measured out in one man's lifespan, on one man's land, at the sufferance of a law that would always call them renegades. Cla would grow old having to buy his nails under a stranger's protection. The children would grow up free on 2 miles of one ranch and jailed on all the rest of the earth. So Nolan chose, her band her choosing, that's the part that has to be plain. There was word that year of some of the western bands going up into the high mountains across the line to the south, into country the American army couldn't follow, where a few were living the old way still, hard and hunted but theirs. It was a terrible road and a thin hope, and Nolan knew both those things better than I ever could. She weighed a caged safety on Eli's spring against a free danger in the high country, and she talked with the grandmother, and with Cla, and with all of them for a long time, through a whole winter. And in the spring, she came down to the ranch to tell us. I wasn't in the room for most of it, but I was there at the end in the yard when they were loading the few horses to go, and I saw the 2 women say their goodbye, and it is the truest thing I have ever watched 2 people do. Marion didn't ask her to stay. That's what got me. Marion, who'd have given her the house, who'd wept for a week when she understood, Marion stood in the yard and did not once ask Nolan to choose the cage, because she'd finally learned the thing too, the thing Nolan couldn't teach with words. That loving someone is sometimes standing still and letting them walk down the free bad road instead of the safe caged one, even when it breaks you. Nolan took Marion's hand, the hand she'd healed, the hand that had set her brother's fingers, and held it in both of hers, the way Marion had held hers that first day at the fire a lifetime ago. You laughed with my grandmother in a language you do not speak, Nolan said. I will tell it to her people in the high country, that there was a white woman who laughed the right way. It is not much. It is more than most of your kind will leave behind them. She looked at Eli then over Marion's shoulder. And you, soldier, you learned it. I said we would see which, and we saw. You did not leave us on the bad road. You found another road, and you walked it till your feet bled, and it still was not enough to give us a country, because no one man has a country to give. But you kept the old man's word, and now his word does not die with him. It goes up the mountain with us. That is what you kept, Eli Kettering, not the spring, the word. The word walks now on its own legs. A pause and the almost thing at the corner of her mouth the last time I'd ever see it. Remember us. It is the only thing worth more than water, to be remembered by someone who owes you nothing. And they went up the wagon road, past the gray grave under the cottonwood, past the spring one last time, and up into the rocks, and were gone into a country I'll never see and can't imagine, toward a hope I have no way of knowing they ever reached. I never learned if they made it. I've told myself 100 stories about it, sitting on this porch. Some nights I'm sure they did. Some nights I'm not. Marion and Eli married proper that summer, in the settlement that had once called him an Indian lover, and now, with vein broken and bright gone to face his inquiry, found it convenient to remember it had always liked the young Kettering fine. People are like that. I've kept the books on human nature longer than I've kept them on cattle, and it's the less honest ledger. They made the Rafter Cay into something. Not rich. The country never let a man get rich honest, but into a home, which is harder and better. Marion's cracked hands healed into strong ones. Eli's stillness over the years turned from the frozen kind into the settled kind, and I lived to see him laugh, which the first month I'd have bet my knee he never would. The spring still runs. I check it most mornings out of a habit I can't break. It runs clear and cold the way it did the day I hauled a dead steer out of it, and every morning I stand there a minute and think about who it kept alive and where they went, and whether the word Amos gave is still walking on its own legs somewhere up a mountain I'll never climb. I carved a thing that first winter after they left. I'm not a man who carves people. I do horses and birds and the one dog that looks like a possum. But that winter I carved a woman's hand, open, holding nothing, and I couldn't have told you if it was Nolan's or Marion's or just the shape of the whole business, and I put it in the coffee tin with all the rest, and I never showed it to anybody. Amos ordered a ranch hand, a wife from a catalog, and died before she came. The wife came anyway and married the nephew and healed beside an Apache woman and stood in a yard and did not ask the impossible of the person she loved most. The ranch wasn't the only thing Amos left him. Everybody understood the ranch. But the ranch was never the thing that mattered. What Amos left him was a word and a choice and one day to walk through one of two doors. And Eli Kettering, who'd carried a story he never questioned and helped kill for it, spent the rest of his life